Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the second installment of our Chancellor Conversation series. My name is Nikay Paredes, and I'm the Senior Programs Manager at the Academy of American Poets. If you'd like to know more about our programs and publications, please visit poets.org. Tonight's virtual conversation is on the topic of poetry and labor, on the poet's labor and how poetry envisions itself as a piece of work, and features the distinguished poets who serve on our board of chancellors. They are Kwame Dawes, author of Nebraska, and the Glenna Lushai editor of Prairie Schooner at the University of Nebraska, where he is a chancellor's professor of English. Brenda Hillman, author of Extra Hidden Life Among the Days, and the Philippi Professor of Poetry at St. Mary's College. Marie Howe, former New York State poet and author of Magdalene, which was long-listed for the 2017 National Book Award for Poetry. Dorianne Laux, author of Only as the Day is Long, New and Selected, and a professor at North Carolina State University. And Natasha Trethewey, former U.S. Poet Laureate and author of Monument, Poems New and Selected, which was long-listed for the 2018 National Book Award for Poetry. Thank you so much again for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Nikay. I am delighted to be here this evening. My name is Brenda Hillman, and I have been honored to ask to moderate this panel on labor and poetry, and thrilled to be with my fellow panelists. We have each been asked to prepare a short statement, and then we're going to have a conversation. We'll have some questions, some of which have come up in our conversations, and others that will come up along the way. So I will begin with something that I have written about the topic, and then Kwame Dawes will go, Marie Howe, Dorianne Laux, and Natasha Trethewey in that order. Thank you for being here. Labor and poetry. I once worked with a dean who referred to poetry classes as navel gazing. It reminded me of the conflicts in American work ethic. We all want useful work, or do we? We text about work at sports events. We commend hard work and job performance. But it's different when it comes to art. Art is supposed to seem effortless, even frivolous for many. The first poem that came to mind when I heard the topic of our panel is Adam's Curse, a memorable poem by W.B. Yeats. The poet is sitting with a ewe, someone he loves. Yeats fans know this is probably Maud Gonne, and her friend, it says probably Lady Gregory, who remarks that women must, quotes, labor to be beautiful, unquote. The poet responds that poetry also takes hard work, and here are some of his lines. A line will take us hours, maybe, yet if it does not seem a moment's thought, our stitching and unstitching has been naught. Better go down upon your marrow bones and scrub a kitchen pavement or break stones like an old pauper in all kinds of weather. For to articulate sweet sounds together is to work harder than all those and yet be thought an idler by the noisy set of bankers, schoolmasters, and clergymen the martyrs call the world. The speaker claims poets must labor to make good poems sound as if we didn't labor at all. As Adam is cursed to labor, so everyone labors. People breaking stones labor, and poets labor just as hard as someone putting in a kitchen floor. Bankers and schoolmasters think poets are just sitting around eating Whitman's chocolates. Yeats's incredible heroic couplets allow him to make adamant declaratives with a proposition that sounds reasonable. 10 lines later, we think it is harder to make a poem than to do physical labor. When I first read this poem as a college student, I thought it was a sketchy proposition. Of course, it's harder to put in a kitchen floor than work on a poem, but I've thought ceaselessly about poetry now for half a century, And I know, and I now think to become the kind of artist you want to be is very hard work. 2, I'm writing my remarks on Labor Day 2021. Labor Day was first proposed in the 1880s by union organizers when working conditions in factories and mines were deplorable. 12-hour workdays, unregulated conditions, and sweatshops. Today, though the conditions are more regulated, the crisis for workers continues. Threats of deportation for immigrant workers and workers of color, including those in domestic and delivery jobs, disproportionately suffer from pandemic risks. The trajectory is against labor equity. Many workers must hold down 3 jobs in this gig economy. Eleazar Castellanos, an organizer from Arriba, Las Vegas Workers Center, states, as immigrant workers, we are risking our lives daily, continuing to work through the pandemic in the face of countless labor violations. When we exercise our rights, we face intimidation. I ask you poets who are listening to dedicate 20 minutes a week using your language skills to write something advocating for laborers beyond the rote signing of petitions. Find out about a specific bill and support it with an action of your own devising. 3, in my childhood, my mother would hold up pieces of lace and say, think of the hands that made this. My mother, an unpaid laborer herself, was an obsessively organized housekeeper. Her idea of pleasure was to sort paper clips into different sizes. She and my father were both workaholics, and I became a poet workaholic. I love working on poems, recopying a draft over and over to achieve a tossed off sound. Each draft allows new linguistic mystery towards something that sounds inevitable. Revision is one of the great spiritual practices. One more draft always helps a poem. Poets do important work for the culture by bringing forth objects that keep the soul alive in its terror and beauty. Doing this is valuable labor, but we cannot be hothouse flowers. Other kinds of labor are needed to change the racist systems, to do family caregiving and community service within our capacities, in addition to enduring the inner precarity of artistic practice. Poetry is something I cannot do without, but is only part of my labor as a human animal. So Kwame Dawes is next.
Thanks, Brenda. So I want to start by saying that I grew up in a home in which my mother was an artist. She was a sculptor. And my father was a writer. He was a novelist and a poet, and apparently a playwright as well. Now, if I end the sentence there, it sounds really, really bourgeois and cute. And it would mischaracterize my life because my parents had to have jobs that were not related to their art, so to speak. My parents never discussed their art as a function of making money. But then I grew up in Ghana and in Jamaica, in which the commodification of art as a kind of valuing of the labor of art, which is the idea that is poetry work in America, is inextricably connected to the idea of the value of work as being commodifiable. In other words, it can make money. So poets can write poetry. And then what I get a lot from young emerging poets is, how can I make money as a poet? How can I make a living as a poet? As if that's what's going to give it its value. And already, even in my conversation, there seems to be a perception that until we can put a financial value on this thing, its relative appreciation in the society is questionable. I didn't grow up in that environment. In other words, I didn't grow up in an environment where that is taken for granted. I grew up in an environment where the musicians, the artists, and so on and so forth did not think it peculiar that they were carpenters or they were, civil servants and so on. And nobody sat down and said, I wish we were in a world in which we could stop doing all those things and make our art. And the question was not whether being a civil servant or being a carpenter or being a bus driver was more important than being a writer or an artist or a poet. The question was, how do you get your rent paid? And yet be faithful to this thing that you're making. And for me, that has always guided my way of thinking and my way of approaching this art of mine. I've benefited economically as a writer, but I've always felt as if that was not the driving force. So it was never a question that there's a relationship between work and labor and effort and remuneration, or so-called making a living. It was never a question in my mind in that regard. However, it is also true that the opportunity that art gives, the opportunity of being a writer, the opportunity and its value in our world, in our community, our singers, our griots, our speakers, that we value them, that we understand their role and function in society, is marked in ways that may not necessarily be economical, financial, and so on. However, I also grew up in a tradition in which one recognized that somebody like Christopher Okibo, one of the great poets of Nigeria, decided that he could not simply stand by during the Biafran War and make poems about it, but he would have to go and fight voluntarily. And he did, and he died, and we lost this great artist in the Biafran War. Are these contradictions? I don't think so. I think that as human beings, my idea of my poetry is that it is building into something that Brenda mentioned, which is its role in society, in exercising our larger community, in our capacity to empathize, to feel with, to understand, and to imagine, and to imagine, and to imagine. And I think that is an invaluable thing that we bring to it. And we bring joy, we bring the opportunity for lamentation, we bring all of these things into the lived life. Is this labor? It is a kind of labor. It is definitely labor. But I guess I'm resisting the temptation to associate remuneration, making money, from the valuing of an activity and an action. And I think there are other standards of value and there are other standards of appreciation and understanding. That being said, I know that a lot was taken away when my father could not continue to do all the writing he did because of the work he had to do. And I did vow that I will never let that happen to me. I work, I write, and I'm going to keep making both things happen in the world.
Thank you so much, Kwame. That was great. And we'll pick up on some of those points as soon as we're having our talk. Marie, how?
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you everyone for being here. It's wonderful to be with you. Kwame, both of you touched on some points, some ideas that have been floating around with me. Last year, I was asked to speak on a panel about how poetry makes nothing happen. And I've been thinking about what that really means, because I do think poetry makes things happen. Here are the lines that have been going through my mind all week. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? T.S. Eliot wrote those lines in 1934 in Choruses from the Rock. And now it's 2021. And the information flow is so insistent and overwhelming, at least in this country, the United States of America, that the human mind can't even elaborate the meaning of the information. We live in a time, as Brenda said, when production is valued above almost everything else. What do you do? We ask someone when we meet them. And what do you do? We live in a time when time itself has speeded up so much that most of the people I know and love say, I don't have enough time, as if time were a material that's kept from us, often by labor or by distraction, by emails, by screens that call to us to answer, to buy, to watch, to subscribe, to like, to dislike, to judge. And we live in a time when language itself is so corrupted. And obviously at obvious political levels, but even on an ordinary level, We participate without meaning to. My dear students say, your t-shirt is awesome. This ice cream is awesome. Forgetting or maybe never knowing that that word awesome used to mean something unsayably sublime. So sublime it would threaten us with annihilation, the fear of God. And like Kwame said, we're living in a time when everything is given a price. A painting, Bansky's shredded painting, just was sold for over $25 million. Poetry earns little or no money, but I think this is to its advantage. It can be copied, it can be memorized, it can be taken, stolen, held within the body and the mind. It can cross borders without detection, enter prisons. It can be carried into gatherings, into lonely, quiet rooms, inside somebody's mouth. So what's the labor of poetry? Brenda said it so well. But for me, the labor of poetry is to become still and receptive in a culture as jittery as ours. Is to cultivate interiority in a culture that celebrates the performative, and is to overcome the fear of poetry that Muriel Rukeyser wrote about. And I didn't understand for a long time, but now I think I do. And I think both writers and readers know this fear. It's complex, and I don't pretend to be able to say what she meant, but for me, the fear of poetry is the fear of actually being here, being present, knowing that I'm alive and I'm gonna die, is to feel the fullness of time, the losses, failures, joys, loves, the bewilderments of my individual life, our collective life. To write a poem is to walk into the unknown without a weapon. Is to read a poem is to walk into the unknown without a weapon. And when we encounter a poem as a writer or a reader, when we touch the consciousness of a poem, or if we are touched, we might be changed. And I think transformation is what we long for and what we fear. It takes courage to enter a poem. Everyone here, everyone listening has known this courage. Every writer is a reader, every reader is a writer. Anything can happen. We might be disappointed, we might be upset, we might be what Dickinson calls heavenly hurt. We might be moved and transformed, but the labor of poetry can bring us back to where we really live, away from the noise and chatter, not away from community, but away from the overload, back to our senses, into that interior place where I think the meanings are, and the unsayable mystery of being alive. So I say workers unite, laborers unite. And I just want to read, I don't know if I have time, but a poem, it's so brief, by Juan Ramon Jimenez. And whenever I think about poetry and what it can do, I think of this small, vast poem. It's translated by Robert Bly. It's called Oceans. I have a feeling that my boat has struck down there in the depths against a great thing. And nothing happens. Nothing. Silence, waves. Nothing happens? Or has everything happened? And are we standing now quietly in the new life? Thank you.
Beautiful, Marie. Thank you so much. That was lovely. And again, so many things you brought up we can talk about. Dorianne, go for it. You'll want to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding me to unmute. And thank you, Marie. That was gorgeous. Beautiful. Hello out there and welcome. I'm coming to you from Richmond, California, in the center of the Rosie the Riveter Park, dedicated to the women who worked for the war effort, building planes. And many thanks to the Academy of American Poets for devoting a panel to poetry and labor, two subjects close to my heart. For years, I've taught a course to both undergraduates and graduate students called The Poetry of Work. Our handbook of sorts is Studs Terkel's groundbreaking book, Working. People talk about what they do all day and how they feel about what they do. It's a book of interviews of workers, and much of what they say is poetry. In addition, my students read and write poems about work, a poem describing a worker or a workplace, a poem in the voice of a worker, a poem in the language of work. I retire soon and so probably won't teach this course again. But if I did, I'd have the students also read the new anthology of poetry called Raising Lilly Ledbetter. Lilly Ledbetter fought for the Fair Women's Pay Act. This is from the introduction of that book. In January 2009, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act was signed into law, President Obama's first legislative act after taking office. Today, women's pay continues to average 77 cents for every dollar earned by men. Pay for women of color averages even lower. Carolyn Wright and her co-editors set out to edit an anthology of poetry about women in the workplace, bringing together voices of women poets in the workspaces they occupy, from cotton rows to corner suites, trawlers to typing pools, nursing stations to space stations, factory floors to faculty offices. For those of you who teach and are interested in this subject, I can include a syllabus, course outline, and reading list in the chat possibly, or you could just take my email and I'll send it to you. Students love this course. They're all on the cusp of entering their working lives and are curious about what it's like, what it means, how they can make a difference. They come away humbled by the class and that sees and gives voice to the workers in our communities as dignified, proud, and necessary. This is an open course, so many students come with no background in creative writing, and yet they produce bright gems of honesty, truth, and beauty. Before the pandemic, students would pair up and go out into the community, usually right across the street from the university, and visit the bagel shop, the bookstore, the clothing outlet, or the pizzeria, and interview a worker in the manner of Studs Terkel, and find out who the people are that are behind the counters and ovens, the clothes racks and cash registers they frequent every day. And they return and make a presentation about what they learned about the life of work and write. I see every place as a workplace, including my little studio here, my notebooks, my pens. My heart and mind and soul are all workplaces for poetry, for what can't be found anywhere but inside the human spirit, and poetry is the work of the spirit. When young poets ask me what's most important to know about poetry, I answer that it's hard work.
Thank you, Dorian. That was great. So many things there about your course I want to pursue. And yeah, so such a rich line of thinking. Natasha, please go.
Thank you. Well, thank all of you. I'm already moved and trying to keep a straight face here. You know, when I learned of our topic, the first thoughts that came to my mind were about my maternal grandmother, Loretta Dixon Turnbow. She was born and raised in the Jim Crow South, 1916, Mississippi. The earliest memory she recounted to me was of watching her mother and within days of each other, both of them sitting on the chamber pot at the foot of the bed, then falling back dead. It was 1919, in the midst of the influenza pandemic that killed millions of people worldwide and more than 500,000 in the US alone. Beyond that story, everything I knew about my grandmother's life was filtered through the lens of work. That's the way she formed her recollections, because despite whatever hardship it framed, she recalled the last time she saw her father when she was very young. He left one morning and never returned. He had been on his way to work, she told me. To make pennies for candy or the movies, she and her siblings set crab traps in the Gulf, then sold their catch, which they cleaned and gutted at the back doors of white people's houses along the beach. After both their parents were gone, she and her sisters helped survive the Depression by taking in wash while her brothers worked at the slaughterhouse, bringing home what they could. Later, my grandmother would even divorce a husband because, as she put it, he would not work. Over the course of her life, she worked several jobs. Her first was as a domestic. Then she operated an elevator in a building downtown Gulfport, attended beauty school in New Orleans, cared for a baby daughter, then opened her own salon in the front room of her house to do hair. My mother's face was on the calendars advertising the business, Lee's Beauty Salon. And as a little girl, my grandmother recalled she would stand outside and call to passersby, "My mama doing hair today." In the 50s, my grandmother went to work at a drapery factory. On the day I was born, she quit and opened her own workroom where she had 3 sewing machines and a great cutting table to make custom draperies. She was a seamstress the rest of her working life, and I spent countless hours in that workroom with her, watching, listening. She designed all kinds of window treatments, cornices and swags and shades, and I loved learning the different words for them, as well as the words for various fabrics, stitches, pleat folds, and decorative notions. From her craftsmanship, I learned the necessity for precision, to look for loose or uneven stitches, the way to tell quality by whether or not the designs on patterned fabric pieced together matched seamlessly to the eye. To create that seamless blending of form, one must make precise measures and cuts, a kind of economy akin to the idea of best words, best order, so that no material was wasted, nothing was out of place, the patterns true, the result a thing of beauty. As she sewed, I listened to the sounds of the machines humming, speeding up or slowing down, her clear alto as she sang, the groan of the overworked window unit air conditioner. She worked every day from 8 until 5, and the workroom was the only room in the entire house with an air conditioner. Summers were miserable, the temperatures often topping 100 degrees. We slept with only box fans to cool us, but she'd bought an air conditioner so as not to sweat on her customers' fabric. Such was the care she put into her work, what she made. Years later, when we lost my mother, I started writing poems, measuring and stitching together words to contend with my grief. My grandmother got up each day and went back to her sewing machine. As far as I know, no one ever called her an artist, though the need to busy herself in noble work, to make beauty, gripped her tight as the stitches she sewed. The titular poem sequence of my first book, Domestic Work, a phrase both literal and figurative, was dedicated to her. And it begins with an epigraph from W.E.B. Du Bois that sums up my grandmother's attitude toward work. I shirk not, I long for work. I pant for a life full of striving. Many years later, I was sitting with her in that workroom, which had by then been transformed into a den, and we were watching the news. Trent Lott, then senator from Mississippi, was taking some heat for having said that the country would have been better off if segregationist Strom Thurmond had been elected president. My grandmother chuckled a bit and said, I made his draperies. It made me think of Lucille Clifton's poem, Study the Masters. Like my Aunt Timmy, it was her iron, or one like hers, that smoothed the sheets the master poet slept on. Home or hotel, what matters is he lay himself down on her handiwork and dreamed. She dreamed too. Words, some Cherokee, some Maasai, and some huge and particular as hope. If you had heard her chanting as she ironed, you would understand form and line and discipline and order and America. Thank you.
Thank you. That was gorgeous. What a rich bouquet of observations and offerings you've given us to start our conversation and continue the conversation. I'm going to ask you all actually to unmute so that we won't have to take that extra 10 seconds trying to find our mute button, and we'll just if you're comfortable to do that. So these were all great. originally, we were talking before we came on about how we had each approached the topic and a little bit of the confusion that we had had, labor and poetry. Are we talking about labor? Are we talking about the hard work of poetry? Are we talking about our lives of work? Are we talking about people's ideas of labor, all the different approaches that we could possibly have taken? And I guess I wanted to start with a question, and maybe we can go off in several different directions, but where Kwame was talking about the distinction between labor and work that many of us have, and that this fundamental conflict that I was trying to talk about in my little piece about, do we value art as work, or is it a different kind of form of labor? And I guess I wanted to expand a little bit about that and what distinctions you all make between ideas of work and ideas of the labor of art, and if there's anything there that we want to amplify. Kwame, I'm sort of thinking of where you started with that. I was reading Lewis Hyde's a paragraph that I found from The Gift in somebody's blog. Work is an intended activity that is accomplished through the will. A labor can be intended, but only to the extent of doing the groundwork, or of not doing things that would clearly prevent the labor. Beyond that, labor is its own schedule. And there's no technology, no time-saving device that can alter the rhythms of creative labor, which I thought was really interesting, trying to put creative labor in a different category from. Yeah. Do you want to say more about that a little bit in terms of your distinction that you were making between that your parents noticed about the way that they had to support themselves? Because that does come up so much, I think, with our students, with our friends.
Yeah, so the term labor is a very loaded term in my space. One of the two major parties in Jamaica, the Jamaica Labour Party and the People's National Party, and both emerged in the 1930s, about 1938, at a time when the question of the labor force and the workers and all of these things. So in a funny kind of way, one is more, ironically, the Jamaica Labour Party is the right-wing party.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Has evolved into the right-wing party. But the peculiar history of Jamaican politics was that they both emerged during a mass movement by workers for rights and for all the things that surround it. And in the British system, of course, the Labour is the left-wing party. Right. But the idea is that it comes out of that socialist thinking. My father was a socialist, a committed Marxist, and I've been reading his letters lately, some letters that he wrote in his 30s, 20s and 30s, and him thinking through the meaning of that. But I think his view was that the artist, it came out of the socialist movement, which is that the artist is serving the revolution, right, and working within the revolution, and therefore he never was equivocal. There was no equivocation about the function of his art within the society, the necessity to ask the question, how does this serve the revolution? How does this serve the movement? And developing these ideas while he was in Ghana during the independence movement became less a kind of pure question of Marxism versus non-Marxism, but became a way of valuing the cultural practices of people in the community, people in the village, people who were the drummers, the musicians, the artists who, because of colonialism, had been silenced, and their work, their art, the beauty of their art was being denigrated. So for him, as a writer and an artist, and as a teacher, and somebody who made a living that way, being engaged in that function was a necessary contribution to the society. So all of that was part of labor. I mentioned that in great detail because I don't think I have been able to shake that sort of idea in my head, despite living in America for so long. It still haunts my attitude, right, to my work, probably to my detriment, but it makes me think of the function of art as being part of a society's understanding of itself and valuing itself and appreciating itself. And that even the personal delight that one takes is part of the building of society, the human part of society. So that's how I would start to think about it and to answer that. I'm sure other people have been thinking in that. By the way, Natasha, that reference to Lucille Clifton is so spot on. My goodness, she was so good. That stuff. Like,
yes.
Just to straighten us out.
I feel like she's perfect for whatever you have to say.
Shush.
How would the rest
of another
go ahead,
I was
Natasha.
Thinking about another thing that my grandmother said that I think somehow connects to this, another anecdote of hers. And I guess I have gotten to the point where when I sit down at my desk to write poems, and this, I think this sort of speaks to what Dorianne was saying too, I do sort of tell myself, this is my job, I'm showing up to my job to sit down and to think and to write poems. But years ago, when my grandmother was still alive, this was after Hurricane Katrina, and she had to evacuate and go to live in this nursing home in Atlanta, where I was at the time. Because I was a professor, I had a lot of time where I could go and see her, and it was all different kinds of times. And I think because of that, one of the women who worked in the nursing home asked my grandmother if I worked, if I had a job. And my grandmother replied with this great sense of pride in her voice, "Oh, yes, Tasha works 2 jobs." And I remember thinking at the time, what is my grandmother talking about? Because in my mind, I had sort of, it was a class thing, like a socioeconomic class thing. Like I had made it to the place in my life where I had a single job. I was a tenured professor, and that was the only thing. Not that I was someone who, like her or some of my ancestors, had to work 2 jobs just to make ends meet. It never occurred to me that my grandmother was wiser than I was giving her credit for, knowing that not only was I a professor, but I had this second job, and my second of my 2 jobs was writing poetry.
That's so beautiful. I love that so much. And it connects so much with what Dorianne and Marie were saying about poetry, the life of the spirit, and our inner work being the form of labor that the culture needs so desperately, and that when we're desperately trying to find value in what we do in an unpaid kind of form of labor that poetry often is, that the huge responsibility that artists have to give so much to the culture, as Kwame, as you're talking about, that your parents sensed in their lives. Natasha, I have to share that while you were reading your piece, I kept thinking of my grandmother, who worked herself to the bone and taught school for 30 years and raised 4 kids, and then made lace in the evening. And she said, I'd say, "Mama, why are you working at this hour?" And she'd say, "Idle hands are the devil's workshop." You had to always be doing something. I don't know, Dorianne and Marie, if you have any thoughts about labor, work, continuum, just the words are sort of interesting in that way.
Yeah, I was thinking about the words, the difference to me between work and labor. which I didn't realize that there was a difference until I started listening and thinking. And I thought, well, for so many years I worked as a waitress, and that work, that I wouldn't call it labor. I mean, there was no product I had at the end of the day. I hadn't made something. I had served people and I had cleared dishes and I had, it just didn't feel like labor per se. When I think of labor, I think of giving birth. I don't know if it's just because I'm a woman, but, I think of the labor of giving birth, which is this long, sustained, right? I mean, labor that produces this whole beautiful, complex human with a life of its own. It creates a whole thing. It's like, and in some ways I think of poetry as more like what I think of as labor.
Mhm. Yeah, that's so true. That's so great.
Versus work, which is over 8 hours and you get a paycheck and, it doesn't have the same payoff. No amount of money could make it labor, which just seems to me a little bit holy.
Marie, did you have any thoughts?
I love what you said about labor giving birth. Well, I keep thinking about so many things. I think of our students. I never occurred to me that I would ever make any money from writing poetry. To me, poetry is a vocation, not a career. It's a vocation in the old way I grew up with, that you're called to something and you serve it. You don't expect anything back and you give everything you've got to it. And if that's not enough, that's okay. You just give what you got. Our students, however, are mistaken in thinking that there's a career in poetry, I think, and it's very disconcerting. And I try to tell them there really isn't. And then I try to point out to them that teaching is not writing. I was teaching before I ever imagined I would be a writer, poet writer. I was a journalist like Dorian. I was a waitress at 100 places. And then I worked for a magazine and a newspaper, but finally I thought I'm going to teach. And I taught 8th grade and then high school. And I just thought I'd be teaching all my life. And so I think that vocation is what art is.
Yeah,
We're
that's
lucky, and we're lucky that it's not a commodity. I want to say this again.
Yes.
Can you imagine if something, I know we get some book deals and we get, some awards, and that stuff is shiny and it helps, and it's only given to a few people, and that's a pain, because everybody should get one. But the other thing is, mostly we don't get anything except the reward of our work, of our work, which is priceless.
Yes, that's so well said.
Well, see, I like the way too that I took down this note because Marie just brought in other words. I mean, we keep having this constellation of words that are connected. They're similar. Like, so first, is it work or is it labor? And I had brought in the word job, and then Marie now has brought in vocation as well as career, and that we can't make a career out of it, but it's a vocation in the oldest sense, which reminded me of that last haiku of Etheridge Knight's, making jazz swing in 17 syllables ain't no square poet's job.
It's wonderful. I want to veer a little bit because I think we maybe have 10 minutes or so left, and talk a little bit about writing your own work, and maybe everyone can just comment briefly about how you think about the actual labor of drafting a poem, whether that gives you pleasure, whether you enter that labor with dread. I'm sure there's a big continuum, but maybe everyone can just say a couple sentences about their relationship. I already commented about I love rewriting and rewriting, but I'd love to hear from everybody else. I'm big on revision. I don't know, Dorian, do you want to start?
Well, I was thinking more of how, back to this idea of labor, that you know, it's not so much in the revision, although I do that a lot, and it is very much work. But after I've written a poem, especially one where I've had to go particularly deep and go places that I'm really unfamiliar with, and, you know, it's like wandering around this foreign land, you know, for hours on end, even though it may only be 10 minutes that you're working on it, but it feels like hours and hours of being immersed in this. It's kind of like snorkeling in Hawaii. You know, you're doing it for what you think is 5 minutes and 2 hours have passed, you know, because it's just a timeless, spaceless, gravityless, you know, world. And sometimes I actually have to take a nap. I mean, I am so exhausted, as if I've actually done, weirdly, this physical labor, but it isn't. It's all, and it's not just the mind that's laboring. It's like every part of me, you know, internal part of me.
Yeats would love that answer.
Yeah.
Marie, do you want to say about your relationship to the actual drafting of poems?
Yeah. Well, I'm similar to you, I think, Brenda. I have all these boxes upstairs that came out of storage after 30 years. And, you know, there's 50, 60 retyped versions of poems, you know, 50, 60, 70 even, with one word changed. Or just everything, it's just compulsive rewriter. But entering the writing is very hard for me. It's like there's a force field. I've written about it, and there's a force field that says, no, you've got to do this, and you've got to do that, and you've got to return this, and you've got to do that, and you're not using the grocery. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's so hard for me to actually enter my job, as Natasha would say, that I have to, I don't know, it's hard. Once I'm there, I'm so happy, so happy, so happy, full of joy. I could work for hours. I want to rewrite. But getting past the border guards who say, you haven't done your taxes, you haven't returned the email from blah, blah, blah. It's really, that's why I think I was writing about the infosphere, drowning in it, because it's hard for me.
That is really hard. Yeah.
I'm a single mother. I was working, a lot of single mothers writing poems these days, and have been some of them here. So that, it's just hard.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Natasha, do you have thoughts about drafting?
Well, like you both, I love the process of revision. And like Dorianne said, I can sit down and forget the time, and 8 hours will have gone by and I haven't eaten, I haven't gone to the restroom. And if I'm really working, I work up a sweat as if I were really doing some heavy lifting. And just like Marie said, the hard part is getting in there. And I think for me, the only way that I can is to read other poets. I mean, that's the only way to break through that force field. And so I won't even allow myself to sit down and open my notebooks, where I've sort of started to keep snippets of things, unless I'm committed to doing all the real work that it takes to get past the force field. Because it seems like a waste of it if I just read what's in my notebook, if I'm not going to commit to doing something with it. And the commitment to doing something with it means staying in the chair and reading something to get me started.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's so true and so useful, I'm sure, to the poets who are listening. Kwame, do you enjoy the drafting, or do you find it torment, or or something between?
You all make me feel like a slacker. No, I writing is a shelter for me. Like to be, and I don't know when I'm not writing. By that I mean I'm walking around thinking about it. Most of the conversations I have with people, I'm not talking to them. I'm thinking in my head something that I'm working through. Like all of this here, I'm already thinking, at Clifton Line. It's going on in my head. So, but it's a shelter. By that, I do a ton of stuff like that have nothing to do with making poems. And therefore the chance to sort of find shelter in this exploration, this thing, it feeds me, and I'm desperate for it, and I run to it whenever I can. So no, my relationship to it is not quite that way, because for me it's not. It comforts me. It assures me. It gives me. It makes me feel I've said it. I stumble talking to people. I stumble explaining, to my wife why I'm being an idiot. I stumble with all kinds, but I can get to it in the poem. I got space, I got time, nobody interrupting me, and I'm cool. And I love that place. I can bring the world. I can be thinking about a movie, and I can be thinking about Du Bois. I can be thinking, and I can find a place where that makes sense for me. So I run to it whenever I can. So that's what it is for me. So no, not. I don't like to draft and then type. That's tedious. That's work.
That's a wonderful distinction. Well, these are all such great answers. I have one more. I don't know if we're going to have time to get through this this other question that I had, and it actually came out of Dorianne's comments, but but I was thinking of it before our talk here today. Has any of you written poems that you find satisfactory about your paying work? So I'm really glad to be reminded of that anthology, Dorianne.
Yeah.
So I think we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd love to hear each of you talk about your poems, about your paying work, as opposed to the creative labor of the poetry mind. Yeah, maybe Marie, do you want to start?
I'm thinking maybe I need to pass because
okay.
I'm thinking poems about work that I was paid for.
Well, no, poems like you mentioned you had worked as a waitress. I'm thinking about poems that I've written a couple poems about my teaching. I've definitely written poems to students. But whether you've found that, and another aspect of that question is, have you written poems about the unseen labor that you all are talking about? In Natasha's case, obviously you have, because of your, so I don't know.
I feel like I've written about, I wish maybe it's here. I've written little poems about, not being able to stay in the chair. They're disguised as prayers in my book, but essentially it's like, help me, I'm about to get out of the chair as soon as I finish writing this sentence. I've written sort of prayers that help me stay writing. But I've written poems about conversations with students. Absolutely. A lot of my poems have dialogue in them, so there's people talking about stuff. But I don't think I've written about my pre-teaching life. I've written about being a mother, which is
I know that's true.
A lot of labor, but also joy.
Part of the reason the question came is that when I find sometimes when I'm talking to people at conferences that they have this full life, they do so much in the hours and hours and hours that they aren't writing or being in our family, and they've never written about their jobs. To use the job word. I don't know, Natasha or Kwame, do you have thoughts about writing about your job?
I laugh at this because of course I've written about money, like when our power went out, like we hadn't paid the bill. We were living in South Carolina. I've written about trying to hustle, but that's because I write about my life. Like so I don't make that distinction. And I always think not everything is interesting. Like you know what I mean. So some stuff is not going to make it in poetry because it's not interesting. Like so, but that's me. But I think when we write about our life, and just how much it's about about the coins. I certainly have written about it. I know it permeates my work, like my eyesight struggles permeate my work. And I think we all do. And we may not be able to say we've done it, but when we read your work, we're going, yeah, okay, so that's what was going on. Because it's there. You can't run from it. That's what I think.
There are people who write directly. I mean, Dorianne,
Yes.
you know.
Dorianne, of course, yeah.
I mean, Phil Levine and,
Sure.
who wrote about it. But Dori, tell us about some of the poets or some of the poems.
Well, I mean, one of the first poems I wrote was about my mother being a nurse, about her work, which was so fascinating to me. But also, wrote about her practicing the piano, playing it every day. That was labor, to me. And she did it for no pay, just like poetry. Nobody ever heard her play, but she was committed to getting better and better and better every day. And, I wrote poems about working in a gas station, being a waitress, but I thought of it when Natasha was talking, wrote a poem about my mother called Singer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about the Singer sewing machine we had in the middle of our living
I
room.
have one too.
I have one too.
We all did.
And it's called
Like we
Singer.
had our own little factories in our homes, and our mother just, right, put out this product, amazing, right? Completely unpaid. And so, I mean, I sometimes think if I hadn't worked before I became a poet, that I was gathering information that whole time,
Well, this business, as you're talking so much, reminds me of what you all are mentioning about the unseen laborer and the unseen, not just the unseen worker, but the unseen laborer. My brother worked in Social Security administration, and who's going to write a poem about him? I mean, he affected thousands of people's lives by making good, wise decisions. And we need to write more about our unseen laborers and the people who really keep the things stitched up. We only have a few minutes left, but I guess I wanted to.
But can I just quickly say
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just to say, Brenda, look, I mean, you can't read African American poetry or Black poetry and it's not about labor. Like that's what you can't avoid it. And there is a dynamic here that we kind of have to recognize that. You think of all the great poets and all the work that, from Langston Hughes and so on and so forth, right up to Natasha, to Kevin and all of us, me writing poems based on August Wilson. What is August Wilson writing about? He's writing about Black labor because that's a part of what makes us. That's part of what we wrestle with, and we are looking to get away sometimes so that we can be free of that burden, but working through that. So people write about that stuff. People write about that routinely, and one of the things I say is we should celebrate that. We should celebrate that work as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. So well said and beautifully put. So does everyone want to say just, I guess, one last thing? I guess I just remembering how much art is how much art and artists are giving with our inner struggles that we're all speaking about. Maybe people want to say one last thing to the audience as we're tying things up today. Natasha, Dorianne, Marie.
Well, yeah, I was still stuck on trying to think about if I'd ever written about a job I'd had, another job I'd had before I was faculty, and I've not, even though there might be some things that could be worthy of a poem. As Kwame said, not everything's interesting, which made me think of one of my favorite poems about sort of in some ways about poetry and in some ways about a job. And that is, I can't remember the title of it, but some of you will know it. It's Elizabeth Alexander. I think it's from Antebellum Dream Books, and it's a dream book, and it's a poem about the speaker's teaching class on poetry. And there's a moment at the end where she feels her voice rising and says, "And aren't we all interesting to each other?"
Can hear her saying it.
That's great. That's beautiful. Marie, do you have a last thought? Kwame and Dorianne?
Loves austere and lonely offices. I mean, I feel like I'm just thinking of those winter Sundays, which is the first thing I thought of when I thought of this labor panel.
Yeah.
Loves austere and lonely offices. And also what Kwame was saying, which is everybody who works and isn't noticed working, by a lot of people, just
Right.
And I think one of the things poetry does, it wakes us up to see what we don't see, who we don't see, and to imagine their lives, talk with them, ask them. I love your idea. I love your class, Dorianne.
And to make
you had said something about, people always ask us, well, what do you do? Because that defines us. But they rarely ask, like these students asked people in their community, what do you do all day? And how do you feel about it? And they loved it. These people, my students would talk to, forever remembered this class. They would send us bagels to the class for free. Or they would tell us, come in and have pizza. I mean, they loved being truly asked, what do you do? So my last words is, I wish all of you work that you love and that you're recognized.
Very well said. Kwame, did you have a last thought?
Oh no, I ditto all of these
it's so important, and to me the intersection and the braiding of the things that we do as public people and as forms of work and our inner intensity in our lives of the imagination are always in conversation. Thank you so much for this very rich and beautiful hour and for all your offerings. I hope you'll have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good to be with all of y'all.
Love to see you all.
Bye.
Fun. See you guys.
Bye.